Good morning. I'm going to continue with my series on the 2021 World Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Nepo. Maybe, it can seem to some people a bit wrong to first do a tribute to Daniel Narodetsky and then carry on. But the world goes on. Life is for those who live. And I don't think Daniel Narodetsky or any of his friends or family would thank us for not playing chess. I think the the greatest tribute we can pay to someone who is so passionate about chess is to play the game we love, enjoy it, and think of Daniel when things happen in the game which remind us of him and the things we learnt from him. So, last game we saw was game 9, which Carlsen won after a mistake which trapped a piece behind enemy lines by Nepo. That was game 9. Game 10 was a draw. So game 6, 8 and 9 were wins, and the other 7 games were draws. So 7 draws is 3.5 points, and 3 wins is 3 points. So Carlsen has 6.5 points. He needs only one more win to retain his world championship. And obviously, Nepo is under a great deal of pressure. He's got to, he's got to win more or less every game now. He can afford one draw and still draw the match. But he's under great pressure. But even although his chess wasn't at its best after the crushing defeat in Game 6, he tried. He tried. We've got to give him credit for that. He tried. He gave it as good a go as he could. So, e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. All things we've seen before. The Italian game with bishop to c4. And the two knights defence. Will Nepo play the two knights attack? The knights attack? No, he won't. It isn't played very often. It's not popular with grandmasters because it breaks principles. Moves a same piece for the second time in the opening, and it doesn't give a very clear and easy to play game for either side actually. But it's not considered a good winning chance by grandmasters. They know what they're talking about. So Nepo supports his pawn on e4 with d3. Bishop comes to c5, and he plays c3. This is to preserve this very important Italian bishop. The Italian bishop, the Spanish bishop, this light squared bishop in these open kingside openings is very important. And he does c3 to preserve it, so that if the knight comes here to attack the bishop, then he can play here first, and then if it gets chased, he can play here and then here, and doesn't get taken. So, yeah. He supports the pawn, and Nepo castles. Now, there are two ways to do the same thing to preserve the bishop, which is either to move the pawn 1 square or to move the pawns 2 squares. On one day, 2 squares will be the most popular amongst grandmasters, and on the next day, moving the pawn 1 square will be the most popular. Today, moving the pawn 2 squares is most popular. It takes a bit more space, but its main function is again preserving this very important bishop, because the bishop is just as important for the player with the black pieces as it is for the player with the white pieces. They both want to preserve this piece. So the rook comes to a1, and the bishop retreats to a7 immediately. It doesn't wait to be attacked. Knight comes to a3. It might when you play knight to pawn to c3 to give the bishop a retreat square, then you're taking away the natural square for the knight. One way into the game is to play knight to d2, knight to f1, knight to e3 or g3, and then maybe into f6. Here, from a3, he has the possibility of going to c2 to support the centre, or of coming to a5, b5 even, to attack the bishop. So, yeah. Comes to h6. But really, attacking the bishop is a bit pointless, because it just moves all the way to b8. It might seem like a really, really dumb square b8, but the thing is that there's actually b5 in this circumstance, which is really dumb, because black can then play the knight here, ready to transfer to the king side, and then he can play c6, opening up another square for the bishop, and then eventually he can play d5, opening up another square for the bishop, probably after castling first. So he takes the other route with his knights, which is more sensible, I believe. And Carlsen castles. Nepo comes to e3 with his bishop and says, yeah, do you want to swap or not? This is another advantage of rerouting knight via c2, is that when you play here, you don't have to take with the rook or the pawn. That if he captures, you can recapture with the knight. And that's exactly what happens. Carlsen takes, and Nepo recaptures with the knight, heading to this square or this square with these knights. Rook comes to e8 to support the e-pawn. Pawn comes to a4. Bit of expansion on the queen side. And Carlsen says, yeah, well, if you could swap off one of the bishops, so can I. And after you've played a4, or indeed a3, swapping off the bishops is probably going to be best, because, yeah, well, you could retreat to b3, I suppose, but yeah, he doesn't. He takes. But Carlsen doesn't take back with the pawn, he takes with the rook. So he's maybe looking at playing knight to h2 and rook to g6 and maybe f5 after he's played knight to e7. So he's got a different plan than Nepo. But neither of them have picked a bad or wrong plan. Both plans make sense. So the queen comes to b6 to attack the b pawn, which forces the b pawn to come forward to b6. Nepo has completed his development, and his rook comes to d1. Yeah, his rooks are beautifully, ideally placed in the opening. Yeah. So Carlsen still has to move his queen off the back rank to be completed with his development, but he doesn't do that immediately. He rather concentrates on getting his knight over to the king side, because Nepo has both knights on the king side and the queen pointing at the king side. So he has to kind of do something about that by moving his pieces over to the king side. The pawn comes to h3 to stop the knight coming here and to support the knight coming here. Stops this knight, maybe supports this knight. The queen comes to d7 now, so that white has completed his development, and the knight comes to h2 so that the f pawn is free to move, ready to start some kind of kingside attack or pawn storm. The rook comes to d8. You can't argue with putting the rooks on the open files. The knight on h2 comes to g4. You could have played the other knight, but then this knight on h2 is looking a bit silly. And the knight takes the knight. And instead of taking with the knight, he takes with the pawn to give support to the knight on this square. So Carlsen plays d5, trying to tempt the pawn away from here so that f5 isn't as powerful a move as it could have been. And Nepo goes for a complete dissolving of the centre with a d4. He takes with the e-pawn, and he takes with the e-pawn, threatening the rook. The rook comes to e4, double threat on the pawn, but you know he's not really threatening to take it because he would have to take it first with the rook, which loses him an exchange, or with the queen, which loses him a queen for a knight. So he isn't threatening to take that pawn. He is, however, threatening to take this pawn with the knight. Queen comes to c2 to attack the rook. Rook comes to f4, where he attacks the f2 pawn, but where he's in a position to be chased away by the pawn. But this allows a little tactic from Magnus. F3, careless move. If we turn on the analysis, it suddenly goes to minus 4.5. It was a blunder. Why? Well, you'll see, because Carlsen immediately plays the little tactical sequence that this move gives him, and he plays yeah, what does he play? 23. He takes the knight straight away. And the knight was the only defender of the pawn on g4. So he has to take the rook. He has no choice, and the queen comes to g4 with check. But yeah, suddenly it's not looking so good for Nepo. Suddenly in the middle of a great attack. King comes to f1, and the queen comes to g3, h3, saying check again. King goes to g1, and the knight comes to f5 to move another piece nearer to the king. He's threatened to play knight here and mate here with the queen on g2. So the pawn goes to d6, threatening to break open the position. The knight comes to h4. He can afford to ignore that because he's threatening mate on g2. Takes the pawn so that the queen defends the g2 square. But this allows knight here check, and then he can take this and, you know, looking reasonably good. It's not quite so simple and straightforward as that, never is, but yeah. So he comes knight to f3, of course. Yeah, why? No, he doesn't. He comes g3 check first, so that he can't put the queen in the way, and so that he can then play knight here. So the king comes to, yeah, I'll just get rid of that move. So he plays queen here check, king comes to f1. That's right, yeah. And then the knight comes to f3, threatening the pawn, the queen here. Rook even on e1. And the queen comes to g2, and it's taken. And the king takes back. And the rook is taken on e1. And it's taken back. And the rook takes on d6. And now we're in a position where Carlsen has 6 pawns against Nepomniachtchi's 5. So his sacrifice on g3 allowed him to win a pawn. But it's more than winning a pawn. The position for Nepo is just, this pawn's weak, this pawn's weak, this square, if he defends this weak pawn, then it gives up this square, fantastic square for the rook. It's just a much better position for black, and Carlsen shows his brilliant endgame technique once more. King comes to f3, rook comes to d2. Do you want to play your rook behind the pawn and be passive the whole game? Do you want to move the pawn and allow the rook to come here, threaten the pawn, and then you have to move that pawn, and then rook come here? It doesn't really make much sense to put yourself in such a passive position. But he feels he's no choice. Carlsen, typically Carlsen, makes everything as good as possible before deciding to strike. Of course, he's in the position to push the h-pawn all the way. So, but he supports the h-pawn first with the g-pawn. He tries to break out. Yeah, he takes that, no problem. And now he comes behind the pawn, keeping the rook pinned on that file. And he can just push the pawn. And the king comes to a more central position, and he comes behind the other pawn. And he pushes the pawn. And the king he came king to d5 so that he can come here. So the rook comes back, king to d5, yeah. And the rook comes behind the pawn, and the rook supports the pawn, and the pawn goes one further. And now he's in a position to come to c6 and begin to harass the pawns, but it's really irrelevant because, he's just getting a new queen anyway. But, he has to keep trying. King comes to c6, and the rook comes to h3. King takes, and the pawn goes to h2. The rook comes to b1, and he takes the pawn with check. And takes the pawn. Brilliant by Carlsen. Says check, threatens the rook. He's got to take the rook, or give up the rook, and then the queen is made. Brilliant little distraction technique. Does he have some hope with this pass pawn? No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. He's well under control with this. So the queen comes to e4, beautifully centralized square. King comes to a7, queen comes to e7 check. King comes to a8, and the king comes out. Rook comes to b6, and the queen comes to c5, and either this pawn falls, or the rook moves, and this pawn falls, and the rook is in the way of the pawn becoming a queen. If he moves the pawn, of course, then the rook falls. So that was enough for Nepo, who resigned, and Carlsen retained his world championship. I did feel sorry for Nepo in this match. He didn't get to show what a great chess player he is. He played some of the worst chess in his career, not some of the best. But up until the sixth game, which he won, which he lost in such a painful fashion, he had played really, really good, really accurate chess, which asked questions of Carlsen and his play all the way through. Luckily, Nepo has since showed what he is capable of doing on a chessboard. So, yeah, all well and good. But that was the last time that Magnus Carlsen defended his world championship. After that, he wasn't interested anymore. So tomorrow we'll be looking at the match before this one. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.